YangGang is a character that we all unlocked in the first 10 minutes of the game, but there are a lot of people who haven't built her yet. Serving the role of a sub-DPS across most of her teams, YangGang is the definition of utility and speed, with some of the most fluid and fulfilling gameplay imaginable. She's a jack of all trades with a lot more potential than players might think, and it's time to explore everything she has to offer. We'll be doing that in my new series, where I'll be raising underused or off-meta characters to the max level, or close to it at the very least, to see whether or not they're worth your investment, be it your materials or your pulls. Raising characters in Wuthering Waves can take quite a bit of time and resources, even with the generous help of leveling events like Parade of Stars. So it's very easy to find yourself short. YangGang with her baseline kit provides a blend of damage, grouping, and perhaps most importantly of all, insanely fast concerto energy generation. All of this starts at her Forte circuit, which enables a special attack if she basic attacks in the air with 3 stacks. She generates these stacks through the 4th hit of her basic attack chain, heavy attacks, dodge counters, her resonance skill, and her intro skill. When she has 3 stacks, her heavy attack is replaced with an upward slash that brings her directly into the air, allowing you to immediately follow up with the special attack. However, it's typically a lot faster to just jump at full Forte stacks and use the attack that way. And similarly, you don't want to activate YangGang's intro unless she already has 2 of those Forte stacks already, as this move will immediately launch her into the air. Her Resonance skill provides a small amount of grouping on a relatively short cooldown, while her Resonance Liberation also groups and knocks up smaller enemies for a much longer duration, and also deals a significant amount of damage. When using all of these abilities together, YangGang has some of the highest concerto energy generation in the game, leading to very fast team rotations and constant uptime on her outro buff that provides 20 total energy to the incoming character, making her an excellent battery for certain lineups. Her inherent skills are nothing to write home about, with the first giving the team stamina after using her Forte enhanced air attack, and the second giving a whopping 8% arrow damage after using her intro skill. Her Ascension stat bonuses are also typical for 4-star characters, with boosts to attack damage and arrow damage, and lacking the critical stats that we typically see on limited 5-stars. When building YangGang, you want to prioritize her Resonance Liberation, then her Forte circuit, and then her Resonance skill. These are all abilities that scale quite well with levels, with her Resonance Liberation dealing the most out of all of her abilities. This Liberation also has some of the lowest energy costs in the game. Her normal attack is primarily used just for the Forte stack on her heavy, and in most teams you won't be using her basic attack chain to generate the stack, meaning you can keep the levels on her normal attack and her intro skill low if you're looking to conserve resources without losing too much damage. For her weapon, YangGang has some great options. For the 4-stars, the new Endless Collapse will be her best option, as its high base attack and built-in energy regen on casting a Resonance skill gives her everything that she needs. Other 4-star options like Commando of Conviction and Lunar Cutter will also get the job done, and will outperform Endless Collapse if you have a lot of copies like me. Overture, the concerto energy generation weapon, is also overkill. YangGang generates a significant amount of energy through her normal rotations, making the weapon's energy regen substat and low base attack far too big of a trade-off in her performance. The BP weapon is also awful on her, as her playstyle isn't focused on basic or heavy attacks at all, making it just an attack stat stick that's outperformed by pretty much every other option. For the 5-star options, Emerald of Genesis is YangGang's go-to weapon. Although she can't fully stack up the weapon's passive given her Resonance skill cooldown, the weapon's energy regen effect and the fantastic base attack and crit rate make it a fantastic stat stick that synergizes well with her overall kit. Blazing Brilliance, Changli's signature, is also usable based off its raw stats alone, but the weapon's big boost to Resonance skill damage doesn't do a lot for YangGang's overall damage profile. When it comes to her echoes, you want to capitalize on her very fast concerto energy generation and easy access to outro skills by slotting her on Moonlit Clouds. Her liberation also generates a significant amount of concerto energy as well, so the built-in energy regen from the set's 2-piece bonus can help you reach the threshold of around 120 to 140% ER for constant uptime on the ability. She can still perform while running Sierra Gale, but YangGang's overall damage usually isn't high enough on her own to warrant your sub DPS losing Moonlit Cloud's massive attack buff. When it comes to her substats, you'll want as many crit rate, crit damage, energy regen, and attack subs as possible, with Resonance Liberation damage bonus as a cherry on top. YangGang is a character that scales very well with crit, especially as you get more of her sequence nodes, but it can be very difficult to have a good ratio given that she has no inherent bonuses across her skill tree. Chances are, you already have multiple reusable pieces from other sub-DPS characters, so the main echoes you'll have to grind will be her 3 costs, which should both be arrow damage at low sequence node levels, but you can replace the arrow damage with attack as you unlock more and more of her nodes. The Impermanence Heron is also the best in slot 4 cost, given the fact that it has built-in energy regeneration and also provides a significant damage boost to your incoming Resonator. As you can see, my YangGang is pretty well built, and is also at S6, and I tested her performance across a wide variety of teams, featuring every limited DPS in the game, and the results were surprisingly good. YangGang lacks in the buffing department, as every other sub-DPS provides some form of damage amplification on their outro skill, but she makes up for this with some of the most flexible, fast, and stylish rotations in the game. The first team up is with Xiangli Yao, a liberation-focused electro damage dealer. Xiangli's best support is without a doubt Shorekeeper, and YangGang benefits tremendously from her crit buffs. YangGang's very fast rotations and low field time requirements make this team one of the most simple to play in the game. A traditional hypercarry rotation, where Changli never leaves the field until he releases all 3 of his hypercubes, gets you a decent level of performance, but it's nothing to write home about. The magic in this team comp is when you use YangGang as a quick swap DPS alongside Xiangli during his liberation. Because YangGang's outro buff only provides energy, and the buffs from YangGang's S6 and Moonlit Clouds aren't lost when Changli swaps off-field, you can weave in abilities like YangGang's heavy attacks, Resonance skill, and her Forte circuit with no DPS loss at all. Zhangli's quick swap windows can sometimes be inefficient for other characters, as one of his most cancelable moves, the follow-up after his Resonance skill, leaves the incoming character in the air. If YangGang's Forte circuit is filled when she swaps in during this state, she can immediately use her Forte enhanced attack. And this is probably one of the coolest combos in the game. Changli is also heavily reliant on his liberation to deal damage, making the regen on YangGang's outro very helpful if you lack the ER stats for consistent uptime. The team can be played at a much higher level with quick swap gameplay, but can still perform decently in a hypercarry playstyle. The main point here is that you have options. The next character up is another hypercarry, Jiyan, and this team was surprisingly good. Unlike Changli, Jiyan is a character that has no real quick swap potential at all. The raw damage output on his Resonance Liberation means that you want to go with the traditional hypercarry playstyle that gives him full, uninterrupted field time. That means a typical rotation starting with Shorekeeper, cycling through outro skills until Jiyan pops his Liberation. Jiyan's Liberation has a duration of 10 seconds and a cooldown of 16, meaning that he realistically only has 6 seconds of downtime between casts. This makes the energy regen of YangGang and her incredibly fast rotation time an insane benefit in his teams, especially in comparison to picks like Mortefi. This means a lot more liberations and less time spent on other characters, in exchange for each of those liberations doing less damage. The end result is extremely competitive, especially when compared to his Biz team. However, Mortefi doesn't really have any other DPS that he supports as well as Jiyan, and with YangGang's flexibility across many lineups, there are better places to put her. Our next team is with Jinhsi, and let me just say that YangGang's lack of coordinated attacks isn't a problem at all in this composition. With Verena slotted in instead of Shorekeeper, her coordinated attacks on her Liberation can provide Jinhsi enough Forte stacks to still deal a respectable amount of damage. YangGang's very fast Concerto generation also allows for incredible uptime on Jinhsi's enhanced state, and perhaps most importantly, her outro skill and Resonance Liberation. Jinhsi's Liberation is the definition of free damage. It isn't an integral part of her rotations, it doesn't enable other abilities, it just deals damage while having a very high energy cost, making Jinhsi one of the best overall recipients for YangYang's outro skill. You'll lack the raw damage potential of characters like Jeja, you'll use far more of Jinhsi's enhanced skills, just with a much lower overall damage on each cast. The end results are, similarly to other teams, very competitive. The only caveat when it comes to this lineup is that you'll want to start the floor with Jinhsi's basic attack rotation just to get her first outro skill out as fast as possible. The last composition we'll be covering is with Changli. This team has a huge amount of potential, but unfortunately it's a bit hard to access. That's because Changli and YangYang are both sword users, and most players only have one copy of Emerald of Genesis to pass around. This meant that I ran these tests with YangYang on Overture, and let's just say that this team's clear times were a lot longer than others. Despite that, this team has an insane amount of synergy for reasons similar to Jinhsi. Changli's Liberation is very, very powerful, and comboing this ability after her Forte Enhanced Heavy Attack is one of the best ways to maximize her DPS. Unfortunately, that means you can be holding her Liberation at full energy, making the next Liberation much harder to weave in at the right moment. This makes YangYang's outro very helpful to maximizing its uptime. Changli is also a DPS that heavily benefits from quick swapping, making the lack of damage buff on YangYang's outro not as significant to her performance. She's also a character with no inherent grouping at all, unlike every other DPS covered, giving even more value to YangYang's utility. Overall, this team has a lot of potential, but it is very hard to gear unless you pull Changli's weapon or have 2 copies of Emerald of Genesis. However, with the new free weapon box in 1.3, you can easily acquire the new Endless Collapse sword and get this team up and running. Now that we've taken a look at some of her teams, it's time to talk about her overall value and power. YangYang's main strength is her flexibility and utility. She's in competition for the lowest field time in the game, and her energy regen outro skill can dramatically lower the requirements for many characters. And for characters like Jinhsi or Changli, who can oftentimes cast their Liberation outside of their typical rotations for damage, she can do quite a bit. However, her lack of damage amp on her outro means that she oftentimes gets outperformed by a character's dedicated support. But unlike a character's dedicated support, she works at high levels with almost every character in the game. This ability improves dramatically as you acquire more and more of her sequence nodes. YangYang's first node gives her a nice buff to her first inherent from 8% arrow damage to 23% upon casting an intro. Her second streamlines her rotations even further, giving her 10 out of the 100 energy required for her Liberation after using a heavy attack. Her third buffs her grouping ability and damage on her Resonance skill, while her fourth and fifth give a massive buff to the damage percent on abilities like her Forte Enhanced Air Attack and her Liberation. These 3 sequence nodes alone make an attack 3 cost far more viable for her performance and potentially best in slot, as these massive damage bonuses make the percentage arrow damage boost from a 3 cost a bit redundant. Her last sequence node, like many other 4-star sub-DPS characters, is easily her best, granting a massive 20% attack buff to the entire team after using her enhanced air attack. When combined with Moonlit Clouds, this turns her into an attack buffer that gives 42.5% attack to your main DPS, that isn't lost when the character swaps off-field, making her one of the most flexible sub-DPS characters in the game, for both quick swap and raw hypercarry lineups. At the end of the day, YangYang is the definition of a jack of all trades when it comes to her role. She supports many different teams with one build, but she can be outperformed by a character's dedicated support. However, as you get more and more of her copies, she becomes one of the best general sub-DPS characters in the game that you can reliably slot on just about every team imaginable. As long as it clears, who cares, right? That concludes our overview of YangYang. With that, we'll be expanding the teams and compositions as this series grows, and I get more and more characters built, so be on the lookout for more in-depth overviews like this in the future. As always, if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace out.